No one knew the letter existed until after the funeral, not because it was hidden particularly well, but because no one thought to look for it, and that alone says a lot about how people misunderstand wealth, power, and what truly matters at the end. The billionaire had spent decades building companies, negotiating deals, and shaping industries. And to the public, his life looked complete, successful, almost untouchable. Yet in his final months, while the world speculated about his fortune and legacy, his attention was focused on something far smaller and far more personal. The letter wasn't addressed to shareholders, executives, or the media. There was no legal language, no instructions about assets or control, just a few pages of handwritten text folded carefully and left in a place only one person would eventually find. When it was finally opened, the first thing that stood out wasn't what he said, but how he said it. The handwriting was steady, but unpolished, deliberate, but unpretentious. And the tone was nothing like the confident voice people knew from interviews and public appearances. He didn't start by talking about success. He started by talking about time. How strange it felt to suddenly become aware of it, not as something to manage, but as something running out, and how that awareness changed the weight of every memory. He wrote about mornings that once felt insignificant, conversations he rushed through, and moments he postponed, assuming there would always be more time later. A dangerous assumption that quietly shapes most lives. As the letter continued, it became clear that this wasn't a farewell meant to impress. It was a reflection meant to be honest, and honesty, when stripped of performance, sounds very different. He admitted that for most of his life, he believed control was the ultimate goal. Control over outcomes, schedules, people, and risk. And that belief had served him well professionally. But it came at a cost he didn't fully understand until control became impossible. Illness stripped away leverage in ways money never could. And that forced him to confront a reality he had avoided for decades. That some of the most important parts of life can't be optimized, negotiated, or delayed indefinitely. He wrote about relationships that survived despite neglect and others that didn't, about how easy it was to confuse presence with priority, and how often he justified absence by telling himself he was doing it for the future. The letter didn't glorify sacrifice, it questioned it. He asked whether building something large was worth shrinking everything else around it. Whether ambition had a natural limit or whether it simply expands until something breaks. What made the letter unsettling wasn't regret, but clarity. The clarity that comes when the future is no longer theoretical and decisions can't be postponed. He wrote that success creates momentum, and momentum makes it harder to stop, to reflect, or to change direction, because the world rewards speed, not pause. And slowing down feels like falling behind even when it's necessary. As he reflected on his rise, he acknowledged that many of his achievements were the result of timing, people, and circumstances he didn't create, a recognition rarely voiced publicly, because it complicates the narrative of self-made success. He didn't diminish his effort, but he stripped away the illusion of total control, recognizing that luck plays a larger role than most are comfortable admitting. One of the most striking parts of the letter was how little it focused on money. Despite the fortune attached to his name, wealth appeared only as context, not as meaning, and when it was mentioned, it was often as a tool that magnified choices rather than defined them. He wrote that money gave him options, but it also amplified mistakes, distancing him from people and moments without him realizing it was happening. Because insulation feels like safety until it becomes isolation. As the pages turn, the letter shifted from reflection to something closer to guidance. Not advice in the traditional sense, but observations shaped by finality. He wrote about the danger of postponing life for someday, about how ambition can become a convenient excuse to avoid difficult conversations, and how clarity arrives too late if you wait for certainty. He questioned whether people chase success to feel secure or to feel significant, and whether those two motivations lead to very different lives. What made these words powerful wasn't that they were dramatic, but that they were quiet, measured, and free of ego. as if the absence of future plans stripped away the need to impress. The letter didn't offer steps, formulas, or guarantees. Instead, it revealed something more uncomfortable: that the choices we repeat daily matter far more than the achievements people celebrate publicly. Near the end of the pages, the tone changed again, becoming more direct, more personal, as if he knew this might be the only chance to say something without interruption. He wrote about a realization that came too late to change everything, but early enough to understand it clearly. A realization about what truly compounds over time and what doesn't. And just as the reader reached that point, it became clear that the final part of the letter contained the one message he wished he had understood much earlier in life. A message that reframed everything he had built, everything he had sacrificed, and everything he thought success meant. The realization he described wasn't dramatic or sudden. It was slow and uncomfortable. The kind that settles in quietly when there is no longer anything to distract you. And it centered on a simple truth he had spent most of his life overlooking: that what truly compounds over time isn't money, reputation, or power, but attention. He wrote that whatever receives your consistent attention becomes your life. Regardless of your intentions, and for years, his attention had been consumed by expansion, optimization, and momentum, leaving little space for presence, reflection, or depth. Success, he admitted, had trained him to think in milestones rather than moments, always pushing satisfaction into the future, always believing that once the next goal was reached, things would slow down. But they never did, because ambition doesn't end on its own. It only ends when something forces it to. The letter acknowledged that if he had understood this earlier, he wouldn't have worked less or dreamed smaller, but he would have protected his attention more carefully, recognizing it as the most limited resource he had, far more limited than money or time. He wrote about how easy it is to confuse busyness with importance, and how often he used productivity as proof that his sacrifices were justified, even when those sacrifices quietly eroded relationships, health, and inner calm. One passage stood out for its honesty, where he admitted that many of the moments he missed couldn't be recovered with apologies, gifts, or explanations, because presence delayed too long turns into absence permanently. The letter didn't ask for forgiveness, and it didn't attempt to rewrite the past. Instead, it offered something more valuable: clarity without defensiveness. He wrote that if someone reading the letter still had time, then they still had choice. And choice is where responsibility lies. Toward the end, the billionaire reflected on legacy, not as something others remember, but as something you live inside every day, explaining that legacy isn't what happens after you're gone. It's what happens while you're here, and the way people feel when they ray around you, and the space you create for others to exist fully. He challenged the idea that impact must be large to be meaningful, writing that some of the most important moments in his life were the quiet ones he rushed through, assuming they were insignificant. The letter also addressed fear, especially the fear of slowing down, of being left behind, of becoming irrelevant, fears he now recognized as illusions reinforced by environments that reward constant motion. He wrote that the world doesn't collapse when you pause, but your perspective often changes, and that change can feel threatening if your identity is built entirely around momentum. As the final pages approached, the tone softened even further, becoming less about insight and more about acceptance of mistakes, of limits, and of the fact that understanding often arrives after decisions are already made. Yet, there was no bitterness in his words, only a quiet resolve to leave behind something honest rather than impressive. He wrote that if he could leave one message, it would be this: that success should expand your life, not compress it, and that anything requiring you to trade your presence indefinitely for a future payoff deserves to be questioned deeply. The last lines of the letter were short, almost fragile compared to everything that came before them, but they carried more weight than any business advice he had ever given. He wrote that in the end, the moments that mattered most were not the victories people applauded, but the ordinary days he didn't rush through, and that the richest life isn't measured by what you accumulate, but but by what you're fully present for. When the letter ended, there was no signature, no closing remark, just empty space, as if he understood that some messages are stronger when they're left open. Those who read the letter later said it felt less like advice and more like a mirror, reflecting questions they had avoided asking themselves. The billionaire's fortune continued to exist, his companies continued to operate, and his name continued to appear in headlines. But the letter quietly became the most valuable thing he ever left behind, not because it offered answers, but because it forced people to reconsider what they were building and why. And while most will never write a letter like his, the truth remains the same. The life we are creating right now is the message we leave behind. Whether we intend it to be or not,